I used to think the sounds in my house were random. Old pipes. Temperature shifts. Normal things people blame when they don't want to feel uneasy. That explanation worked, until I tested it. One night, without thinking much about it, I made a small sound on purpose. Then I waited. A few seconds later, something inside my house repeated it. Not as an echo. Not immediately. But with timing that felt deliberate. I told myself it was coincidence. I needed it to be. But the next time it happened, it responded the same way. And the time after that, it adjusted when I changed what I did. That was the moment coincidence stopped being a comforting explanation. Because houses don't adapt. They don't repeat behavior. And they don't wait for you to act first. What happened over the weeks that followed is the reason I don't ignore quiet anymore. Because once I started paying attention, I realized something inside my home had been doing the same. I didn't move into the house expecting anything unusual. It wasn't old in the way people usually mean when they talk about strange buildings. No history anyone talked about. No stories. Just a quiet place in a quiet area, the kind of house you choose because nothing about it stands out. At first, it behaved exactly how a house should. It made sounds. Small ones. Ordinary ones. Clicks when the temperature changed. A soft knock in the walls when the pipes adjusted. The faint settling that happens late at night when everything else is quiet. I barely noticed them. Most people don't. You only start noticing when the timing feels off. The first time I paid attention, it wasn't fear that made me stop. It was curiosity. I was sitting alone one night, doing nothing important, when I heard a short sound from somewhere behind me. Not loud. Just distinct enough to register. I remember thinking, that was oddly timed. Not alarming. Just, placed. I ignored it. A few minutes later, another sound came. Different location. Similar length. Again, I dismissed it. Houses do that. But something about the spacing stayed with me. It felt intentional in a way I couldn't explain, and that thought bothered me more than the noise itself. So I did something small. Almost careless. I made a sound on purpose. Nothing dramatic, just a light tap against the surface near me. Then I waited. At first, nothing happened. I remember almost laughing to myself for even trying. Then, a few seconds later, I heard it. A response. Not a copy. Not an echo. Just a sound of similar length, coming from elsewhere in the house. It wasn't loud. It wasn't aggressive. It was, placed. I stood there longer than I meant to, listening. Nothing else followed. That should have been the end of it. Over the next few days, I told myself what anyone would. Coincidence. Timing tricks your brain. Once you start looking for patterns, you find them everywhere. And for a while, that explanation worked. Mostly. Until I noticed something else. The sounds didn't happen randomly throughout the day. They happened when I was still. When the house was quiet. When there was space for them to stand out. It was subtle at first, but once I noticed that pattern, I couldn't unsee it. So I tried something small again. I waited until everything was quiet, then made another sound. A different one this time. I waited. A few seconds passed. Then came a response, not identical, but close enough to feel intentional. That was the moment I stopped telling myself it was coincidence. Because coincidence doesn't adjust. I didn't tell anyone about this at first. It sounds ridiculous when you say it out loud. I think my house is responding to me isn't something you casually bring up. So I kept it to myself and started paying closer attention. Not in a dramatic way. Just noticing. Listening. What I found was that the responses didn't happen every time. Sometimes nothing followed at all. Other times, they came quickly. Sometimes they were delayed. But they always shared one thing in common: timing. They never interrupted noise. They appeared in quiet. Almost as if the quiet mattered. I started to test that idea. If I stayed completely still, nothing happened. If I distracted myself, nothing happened. But if I focused, even slightly, on the space around me, the sounds were more likely to come. That realization unsettled me. Because it suggested the trigger wasn't movement. It wasn't sound. It was attention. And attention is harder to control than you think. The next step happened without planning. I started repeating the same small action on different nights. Same movement. Same timing. Sometimes I got a response. Sometimes I didn't. But when it did happen, it was always similar. Consistent. Careful. Like something sticking to a rule. That's when I began to feel uneasy in a way I hadn't before. Because rules imply structure. And structure implies intention. One night, I tried something different. Instead of making a sound right away, I waited. I stayed completely still and just listened. The house was quiet for a long time. Long enough that I almost gave up. Then, without warning, a sound came from deeper inside the house. Short. Controlled. Almost restrained. I hadn't done anything to trigger it. And that's when the thought finally settled in. It wasn't only responding anymore. Sometimes, it was starting things on its own. I remember standing there, trying to explain it away. Maybe pressure changes. Maybe delayed noise. Maybe coincidence layered on coincidence. But the timing didn't feel random. It felt chosen. And the more I paid attention, the clearer it became that the sounds followed a kind of logic, not one I understood, but one that was consistent. That realization changed how I moved through the house. How long I stayed still. How much attention I allowed myself to give the quiet. Because once you notice patterns like that, you can't unsee them. And once you start listening closely, it feels like something else might be listening too. After that night, I told myself I would stop paying attention. Not because I was scared, at least not yet, but because attention seemed to make things worse. The more I focused on the quiet, the more the quiet seemed to respond. So I tried to live normally. I kept the TV on longer. Let background noise fill the rooms. I avoided sitting in silence. I avoided listening for anything at all. For a while, that worked. Nothing unusual happened. And that almost convinced me it had all been coincidence. Almost. The next change came slowly. So slowly I didn't notice it at first. It started with timing. I began to realize that when the house made sounds, they weren't spread randomly through the day. They clustered around certain moments, moments when I paused, when I stopped moving, when I was between tasks. If I stayed busy, nothing happened. If I stopped and stood still, something often did. That pattern alone might not mean much. But once I saw it, I couldn't stop testing it. One evening, I stood in the kitchen and did nothing. No phone. No movement. No sound. I waited. 30 seconds passed. Then a minute. Just as I was about to move again, a short noise came from another room. Not loud. Not sudden. Just, placed. It felt less like interruption and more like timing. I tried again later that night. Same result. Stillness first. Then response. That's when I started keeping quiet notes. Nothing formal. Just times. Locations. What I was doing before and after. At first, I expected the pattern to fall apart once I paid closer attention. Instead, it became clearer. The responses didn't happen randomly. They followed conditions. Quiet. Stillness. Awareness. If one of those was missing, nothing happened. If all three were present, something usually did. That realization bothered me more than I expected. Because it meant the house wasn't just noisy. It was selective. I decided to test consistency. I chose one small action, the same one every time, and repeated it on different days. Sometimes in the morning. Sometimes late at night. Sometimes with other noise in the background. Sometimes in complete silence. The results weren't identical, but they were related. When a response happened, it was always similar in length. Similar spacing. Similar restraint. Never sudden. Never chaotic. It felt measured. Like something following a rule. At this point, I started recording. Not professionally. Just short audio clips on my phone. I didn't tell anyone I was doing it. Partly because it sounded ridiculous. Partly because I wasn't sure what I'd say if someone asked why. The first few recordings didn't capture much. Background noise. Static. Normal house sounds. But eventually, I caught something. A short sound that appeared right after one of my deliberate actions. Listening to it through headphones felt different than hearing it live. The timing was clearer. The pause before it stood out. It didn't overlap. It waited. That detail stuck with me. I began lining recordings up side by side. Different days. Different times. Different rooms. The sounds weren't identical, but they shared structure. A similar length. A similar spacing. A similar restraint. It was like hearing variations on the same idea. That's when the thought crossed my mind, quietly, reluctantly. This feels practiced. I didn't like thinking that. So I tried to break the pattern. I changed my routine. Moved furniture. Spent time in different rooms. Changed when I was awake. Changed when I was quiet. For a while, nothing happened. And I felt relieved. But that relief didn't last. Because slowly, carefully, the responses returned. Not in the same places. Not at the same times. But still tied to moments when I was still and aware. As if whatever was happening had adjusted. That was the first time I felt a flicker of unease that wasn't abstract. Because adjustment means feedback. And feedback implies something is paying attention to results. I remember sitting on the edge of my bed one night, realizing I had started predicting when something might happen. Not with certainty. Just a sense. A tension. A pause before sound. And more often than not, I was right. One evening, I tried something I hadn't before. I didn't make a sound. I didn't move. I didn't wait expectantly. I simply focused on the idea of listening. The house stayed quiet longer than usual. Long enough that I assumed nothing would happen. Then, softly, a sound came from down the hall. Slower than the others. More controlled. As if it had waited for something specific. That moment stayed with me. Because it felt less like reaction and more like initiation. I started to realize something unsettling. The responses weren't just tied to what I did. They were tied to when I noticed. When my attention turned outward. When my awareness sharpened. That made me uneasy in a way I couldn't fully explain. Because attention isn't something you can always control. And once you start monitoring it, it changes. I stopped recording for a while after that. Not out of fear. Out of uncertainty. I didn't know what I was collecting anymore. Patterns, maybe. But patterns that seemed to be refining themselves. Learning which moments mattered. Learning when to appear. And learning when to wait. By the end of that period, one thing had become clear to me. Whatever was happening inside the house wasn't random noise anymore. It followed conditions. It responded to behavior. And it adjusted when that behavior changed. I still didn't know what it was. I still didn't have proof of anything beyond coincidence. But I had a growing sense that something was paying attention to the same moments I was. And that realization made the silence feel different. Heavier. As if it wasn't empty at all. By the time I reached this point, I had stopped thinking in terms of random noise. I didn't say that out loud. I didn't even fully admit it to myself. But the way I behaved had changed. I was more deliberate. More cautious. I paid attention to details I used to ignore. Not because I was afraid, not yet, but because the patterns were becoming too consistent to dismiss. What unsettled me most was that the patterns didn't reset. They carried over. At first, I thought each day was a clean slate. New day, new conditions, new chances for coincidence. But after a while, I noticed that certain responses only happened after I had already triggered them once before. If I repeated a specific action that had once produced a response, I was more likely to get something similar again. Not every time. But often enough to notice. That alone would have been strange. What made it worse was that variations started to appear. The responses weren't identical copies. They were adjusted. Shorter. Longer. Slightly delayed. Slightly repositioned. It felt less like repetition and more like refinement. I started keeping more careful notes. Not because I thought I was documenting something extraordinary, but because I needed a way to keep track of what I was experiencing. Times. Places. What I had been doing beforehand. What happened afterward. When I reviewed those notes later, a pattern stood out that I hadn't noticed in the moment. Some responses only appeared after I had experienced them before. Almost like they had to be introduced first. Once a certain type of sound occurred, it became part of a small set that could reappear later. That realization made my stomach tighten. Because it suggested continuity. And continuity requires memory. At this point, I still tried to ground everything in logic. Old buildings can repeat behaviors under similar conditions. Materials expand and contract in predictable ways. Air pressure shifts. Temperature gradients form patterns. I told myself all of that. But the problem was consistency. These sounds weren't just repeating. They were being reused selectively. One evening, I decided to test this idea carefully. I chose a sound that had only occurred once before. A subtle one. Easy to miss. I recreated the conditions as closely as I could remember. Same room. Same time of night. Same stillness. I waited. Nothing happened at first. Then, after a pause longer than usual, the sound appeared again. Not louder. Not closer. Just present. I remember feeling a brief, sharp jolt of recognition. Not fear, recognition. Because this wasn't coincidence stacking on coincidence anymore. It felt like retrieval. That word stuck with me afterward. Retrieval. As if something had accessed a stored pattern. That idea bothered me enough that I stopped testing for a few days. I tried to go back to normal routines. More noise. More distractions. Less attention. And for a while, the house was quiet again. Too quiet. The absence itself began to feel deliberate. Like a pause instead of an end. When the responses returned, they did so differently. They didn't wait for me to initiate. They appeared during moments when I wasn't expecting them at all. Moments when I was relaxed. Distracted. Not testing anything. That change was subtle, but important. Because before, the timing had always felt conditional. Now it felt anticipatory. One night, I was sitting still, not thinking about anything in particular. A sound occurred nearby. Short. Controlled. Familiar. It was one I recognized from earlier recordings. I hadn't done anything to prompt it. I hadn't focused. I hadn't waited. It simply happened. And that was the moment something shifted inside me. Because it meant the pattern didn't require my action anymore. I started to notice how often this happened during moments of mental quiet. Not silence in the room, silence in my attention. When my thoughts slowed. When I wasn't focused on any task. Those were the moments when the responses appeared most reliably. That realization made me uncomfortable in a way I had trouble naming. Because you can control your actions. You can't always control your state of mind. I began to wonder whether the house wasn't reacting to sound at all. Whether it was reacting to presence. Not physical presence, I was always there. But awareness. Attention. The moment when your focus settles and lingers. Once that idea formed, it was hard to ignore. Because it explained too much. I tested it carefully. I would sit still and deliberately occupy my mind, counting, replaying music in my head, anything to stay internally busy. Nothing happened. Then I would let my attention drift outward. Not listening. Just, open. And often, within moments, a sound would follow. The correlation wasn't perfect. But it was strong enough to unsettle me. The next thing I noticed was timing. The responses were no longer immediate. They seemed to wait. Sometimes several seconds. Sometimes longer. As if timing itself mattered. As if the delay was intentional. That delay created a strange tension. Because it meant I had time to anticipate something I couldn't predict. Eventually, I began to recognize certain responses before they happened. Not clearly. Not confidently. Just a faint sense that something was about to occur. A subtle tightening. A pause that felt heavier than normal. And then, often, the sound would come. When that happened, my reaction wasn't fear. It was something closer to unease mixed with recognition. Like realizing a routine had formed without your permission. I stopped recording again after that. Not because I was frightened. Because recording suddenly felt inappropriate. Like I was documenting something that hadn't agreed to be observed. That thought surprised me. And disturbed me. Because it meant I was starting to think in terms of intent. At this stage, I still didn't believe anything impossible was happening. I just knew that the system, whatever combination of structure, sound, and timing existed in that house, had begun behaving in a way that resembled learning. It responded differently over time. It reused earlier patterns. It adjusted to changes. It appeared more often when my attention aligned a certain way. Those were facts, or at least observations. And they led to a conclusion I didn't want to reach. If something can adjust. If it can remember. If it can change its behavior based on past outcomes. Then at some point, the difference between noise and response starts to blur. And once that boundary blurs, it becomes difficult to tell where coincidence ends. By the end of that period, I was no longer asking whether the house was responding. I was asking how much it understood. And whether it had started to expect something from me in return. By this point, I had stopped thinking of what was happening as a series of strange coincidences. Not because I had proof of anything unusual, but because the behavior had begun to narrow. It wasn't just repeating patterns anymore. It was choosing when to use them. And that change made everything feel more personal than I was comfortable admitting. The first thing I noticed was consistency around my routines. Not the obvious ones, like when I went to bed or left the house, but the small, unimportant habits I barely paid attention to. Pauses. Moments when I leaned against a wall. The way I stopped moving when I was thinking. Those moments began to line up with responses more often than chance should allow. At first, I assumed I was imagining the connection. So I changed things. I altered my schedule slightly. Moved around at different times. Spent more time in rooms I usually ignored. For a while, the house stayed quiet. And I felt relief. But then the responses returned, not in the old places, not at the old times, but adjusted to the new ones. That adjustment unsettled me more than anything before it. Because it meant the pattern wasn't tied to location. It was tied to me. One night, I tried something deliberate. I stayed still in a place I almost never stood. I didn't wait expectantly. I didn't listen closely. I just paused. The silence held longer than usual. Long enough for me to assume nothing would happen. Then a sound came from behind me. Soft. Controlled. Familiar in structure. I hadn't heard that specific variation in days. The timing felt intentional. I remember feeling a brief, cold awareness settle in my chest. Not panic. Recognition. After that, I began noticing how specific the responses were becoming. They weren't just happening around me anymore. They seemed placed in relation to where I was. If I moved to another room, the source shifted accordingly. Not immediately. Not predictably. But often enough to feel meaningful. I tested this carefully. I would stop in one place, wait, then move somewhere else without making noise. Sometimes nothing happened. Sometimes, after a delay, a sound came from the general direction I had just left. Other times, it came from where I was now. It felt like trial and adjustment. Like something gauging distance and position. I told myself there were ordinary explanations. Sound travels. Structures carry vibration. Old materials respond unevenly. All true. But none of that explained the timing. Or the selectiveness. Or why the responses seemed to prefer moments when I was mentally still. Another change became impossible to ignore. The responses were no longer limited to repetition. They began to vary in structure. Some were shorter. Some slightly longer. Some spaced differently. They felt intentional in their variation. Like choices being made within a narrow range. That idea bothered me more than the sounds themselves. Because variation suggests decision-making. I started paying attention to my own reactions. Not fear, I still wasn't afraid in a typical sense. But anticipation. I noticed that before certain moments I would feel a subtle tightening. A sense that something might happen. And often, something did. That anticipation wasn't conscious prediction. It was more like recognition of a familiar rhythm. A rhythm I hadn't agreed to learn. One night, something happened that marked a clear shift. I was standing in the hallway, thinking about something unrelated. My attention drifted inward. I wasn't listening for anything. I wasn't testing. I was simply paused. Then a sound came from nearby. Short. Measured. The same one I had heard earlier that week. The timing was exact enough to make my stomach drop. Because I realized I hadn't done anything to trigger it. I hadn't moved. I hadn't focused. I hadn't waited. It had arrived on its own. That was the first moment I considered the possibility that the responses were no longer reactive at all. They were initiating. That thought changed how the house felt instantly. Not louder. Not darker. Just, attentive. Like a space that had started to notice when I was present in a different way. From then on, I became more aware of how often the responses aligned with my internal state. If I was distracted, they were rare. If I was calm and still, they were more likely. If I was thinking deeply, they sometimes came with unsettling precision. It wasn't perfect. But it was consistent enough to matter. I began to feel as though the house was responding to something quieter than movement. Something beneath behavior. Awareness. That idea made me uncomfortable, because awareness isn't something you can turn off easily. You can pretend not to notice. But you can't fully stop being aware. At this point, I started avoiding silence altogether. I left background noise on. Music. Fans. Anything. The activity helped. The responses slowed. Sometimes stopped entirely. But the quiet always returned eventually. And when it did, the pattern resumed. As if it had simply been waiting. One evening, I tested that idea without planning to. I turned everything off. Lights. Devices. Background noise. I stood still in the middle of the room. I didn't wait expectantly. I just stood. The silence stretched longer than usual. Long enough to make me shift my weight. Then, from somewhere nearby, came a familiar sound. One I hadn't heard in days. The timing felt deliberate. Not reactive. Not accidental. Deliberate. And for the first time, I felt a clear boundary being crossed. Not in a dramatic way. In a quiet, unmistakable one. After that, I began to feel less like an observer and more like a participant. Not because I wanted to be, but because the responses no longer depended on my actions alone. They appeared to depend on my presence. My awareness. My attention. That shift changed how I experienced my own home. It no longer felt like a neutral space reacting to physics. It felt like a system that had learned enough to anticipate. I didn't tell anyone. I didn't write about it online. I didn't ask for explanations. I was afraid that saying it out loud would make it feel more real. Or worse, make it sound unreasonable. Instead, I started keeping everything in my head. Tracking patterns. Comparing days. Watching how the responses changed. And slowly, a disturbing idea began to form. Not fully. Not clearly. Just enough to linger. The idea that whatever was happening wasn't trying to startle me. It wasn't trying to scare me. It was trying to engage. By the end of that period, I had stopped asking whether the house was responding. That question no longer felt useful. The more important question had become something else entirely. Why did it seem to care when I noticed? By this point, I had stopped pretending the pattern would fade on its own. It didn't matter how much background noise I kept on. It didn't matter how busy I stayed. It didn't matter how often I told myself I was overthinking everything. The responses always came back. Not constantly. Not aggressively. Just, consistently enough to remind me they hadn't gone anywhere. What changed during this period wasn't the frequency. It was the direction. At some point, the responses stopped feeling general and started feeling specific. Not louder. Not closer. But more precisely timed. They began appearing during moments that felt personal in a way I couldn't easily explain. Moments when my thoughts slowed. When my attention wasn't scattered. When I was quietly focused on something internal. That's when they tended to happen. And once I noticed that, I couldn't stop noticing it. I remember one evening very clearly. I was sitting alone, not doing much, just thinking through something personal I hadn't talked to anyone about. There was no sound in the house. No movement. No background noise. Then, gently, a familiar sound appeared. Not sharp. Not sudden. Just present. It arrived right in the middle of that thought. The timing felt too exact to ignore. I remember feeling a chill of recognition rather than fear. Because it felt less like a reaction to my movement. And more like a response to my state of mind. After that, I started paying attention to when the responses appeared in relation to my thoughts. I didn't test this deliberately. I just observed. And the pattern kept repeating. When my thoughts were scattered, nothing happened. When I was distracted, nothing happened. But when my attention narrowed, when I became still inside, the sounds were more likely to appear. That realization changed how I experienced silence. It no longer felt neutral. It felt like a condition. I tried to resist reading meaning into it. I told myself that human brains are good at finding connections that aren't there. That timing alone can feel intentional when it isn't. But the consistency made it hard to dismiss. Especially when the responses began to line up with specific emotional states. Not emotions in a dramatic sense, just subtle shifts. Tension. Focus. Fatigue. Moments of inward attention. Those were the moments that seemed to matter. There was one night that stands out more than the others. I had been sitting quietly for a long time, not thinking about the house at all. My thoughts drifted to something personal and unresolved. The kind of thought you don't usually share. The room was completely still. Then, from nearby, a sound appeared. Soft. Measured. Familiar. It didn't startle me. It didn't even surprise me. What it did was make my chest tighten. Because the timing was too precise. It felt aligned. I remember thinking, very clearly. That wasn't random. And immediately after that thought, another sound followed. Not the same as the first. Slightly different. Shorter. Almost like a response to the realization itself. That moment stayed with me longer than any other. Because it suggested not just awareness, but adjustment. After that night, avoidance stopped working altogether. Keeping noise on didn't help. Distracting myself didn't help. The responses still came, though less frequently. And when they did, they felt more deliberate. Like they were waiting for specific internal conditions rather than external ones. It made me uneasy in a quiet, persistent way. Because you can control your actions. You can control your environment. But you can't fully control when your attention settles. I began to notice another shift. The responses seemed to favor certain moments of emotional weight. Not dramatic ones. Subtle ones. Moments of reflection. Moments of fatigue. Moments when my guard was down. They didn't happen when I was alert or actively listening. They happened when I wasn't expecting anything at all. That made them harder to dismiss. And harder to predict. I started to feel like I was being met halfway. Not pursued. Not chased. Just acknowledged. That idea bothered me more than fear would have. Because it implied some level of recognition. And recognition creates a kind of relationship, even if it's one-sided. At this stage, I considered telling someone. But every time I tried to frame it in my head, it sounded unreasonable. There was no dramatic event to describe. No single moment that proved anything. Just a long sequence of subtle correspondences. Patterns that only made sense if you had lived inside them. So I stayed quiet. And the quiet stayed with me. One night, after several days of relative calm, something happened that marked another shift. I was lying still, eyes open, not thinking about much at all. The house was quiet. Then, without warning, a sound came from closer than usual. Not loud. Not sudden. Just nearer. The familiarity of it made my breath catch. Because it was a pattern I recognized, one I hadn't heard in a while. And I realized something unsettling in that moment. It hadn't disappeared. It had been waiting. That realization reframed everything that came before it. The pauses. The gaps. The silence. They weren't endings. They were intervals. Spaces between interactions. And once I saw them that way, the quiet itself started to feel active. Like something held in reserve. From that point on, I couldn't shake the sense that whatever was happening wasn't just responding anymore. It was choosing moments. Choosing timing. Choosing when to appear. And more unsettling than that, it seemed to know when I was ready to notice. I didn't feel threatened. Not directly. What I felt instead was a growing pressure. A sense that something expected acknowledgement. Not fear. Not reaction. Just recognition. And I didn't know what would happen if I refused to give it. By the end of this phase, one thing had become clear to me. Avoidance wasn't protection. Silence wasn't safety. And whatever this was, it no longer depended on my actions alone. It was responding to something quieter. Something internal. Something I couldn't easily shut off. By the time this phase began, I had stopped asking whether something was happening. That question had already answered itself. What I didn't understand yet was what kind of interaction I was part of, or how far it could go. Because this was the point where the responses stopped feeling indirect. They started feeling aimed. It began subtly, the way everything else had. A shift in timing. A narrowing of coincidence. Moments that felt placed rather than accidental. But this time, the placement carried intention. I noticed it one evening when I was standing still, thinking about whether I should finally tell someone what had been happening. I wasn't speaking. I wasn't moving. I wasn't even fully committed to the thought. Then a sound came from nearby. Not loud. Not sudden. Just precise. The timing made my chest tighten. Because it came exactly at the moment the thought formed. Not after. Not before. With it. That was the first time I felt something like hesitation. Not fear, hesitation. A pause in my thinking, as if part of me was suddenly aware of being observed in a way that didn't involve eyes. I stayed very still. The house stayed quiet. Then, after a short delay, another sound appeared. Different from the first. Shorter. Almost corrective. Like a response layered on top of the moment itself. I remember whispering, without planning to. Okay. The word came out automatically. I don't know why I said it. The moment I did, I regretted it. The silence afterward stretched longer than usual. Long enough to make me wonder whether I'd crossed some line by acknowledging anything out loud. Then something answered. Not loudly. Not sharply. But clearly enough that there was no mistaking when it began. The timing was too clean. Too direct. It followed my voice. That moment changed the entire dynamic. Because until then, everything had happened around my presence. Now it was responding to my participation. And I couldn't undo that. After that night, the pattern sharpened. Sounds no longer appeared randomly throughout the day. They clustered around moments when I spoke softly to myself. Or when I paused mid-thought. Or when I acknowledged what was happening, even internally. It was as if awareness itself had become the trigger. I tested this carefully. Not recklessly. Not dramatically. Just quietly. One night, I stood still and thought, very clearly, if this is real, something will happen. Nothing did. I waited. Still nothing. I felt foolish for even trying. Then I shifted my attention away, just slightly. And that was when the sound came. Not in response to the thought. In response to the moment I stopped trying to control it. That distinction mattered. From then on, I noticed a pattern that unsettled me deeply. Intent didn't activate it. Expectation didn't activate it. Attention did. The softer kind. The kind you slip into without noticing. The kind that comes when you stop guarding yourself. I began to feel like I was being met in those moments. Not interrupted. Met. And that difference changed how I experienced the space around me. The house no longer felt passive. It felt attentive. There was another night, later, when things crossed a line I hadn't expected. I had been lying still, eyes open, listening to the quiet. I wasn't thinking about the situation. I wasn't testing anything. I was just awake. Then, very gently, a sound appeared, closer than usual. Close enough that I could tell its direction without effort. It wasn't alarming. But it was intimate. And it felt deliberate. As if distance itself had been adjusted. My breathing slowed without me deciding to slow it. I didn't move. I didn't speak. I just listened. The silence afterward felt thick. Not heavy, focused. Then something happened that made my stomach drop. Another sound followed. Different from the first. Slightly altered. As if responding to my stillness. As if acknowledging that I was listening. I remember thinking, very clearly. This isn't coincidence anymore. And immediately after that thought, the pattern changed again. The sound did not repeat. Instead, the silence returned, longer than usual. Almost expectant. That was when I realized something deeply unsettling. The absence itself now felt intentional. From that point on, even nothing meant something. If the house stayed quiet, it felt like restraint. If it responded, it felt like engagement. Either way, I was no longer just observing events. I was part of the exchange. I started noticing that certain internal states made everything stop. If I felt anxious, nothing happened. If I tried too hard to listen, nothing happened. If I anticipated, nothing happened. But when I relaxed, when my attention softened, that's when responses returned. It was as if whatever this was avoided tension. Avoided pursuit. But recognized openness. That realization made me uneasy in a way I struggled to explain. Because openness isn't something you can fake or suppress easily. It's a natural state. And once I noticed how strongly it correlated, I couldn't stop noticing it. There was one evening that marked a clear boundary. I had been thinking about the idea of acknowledgement. About whether noticing something gives it permission. That thought lingered longer than I meant it to. And then, without warning, a sound appeared, very near. Closer than any before. Not abrupt. Not aggressive. Just present. The closeness made my breath catch. I didn't move. I didn't speak. And then, for the first time, something happened that felt unmistakably responsive. A second sound followed. Different again. Placed carefully. As if layered. As if chosen. I remember a wave of realization passing through me. Not panic. Not fear. Understanding. A quiet, heavy understanding. That this was no longer a pattern I was uncovering. It was a process I was inside. After that night, the house felt different even when nothing happened. The silence carried weight. The space felt attentive. And I became aware of how often I adjusted my behavior without meaning to. Lowering my voice. Pausing my thoughts. avoiding certain moments of stillness. Because I knew, not logically, but intuitively, that stillness invited response. I began to wonder whether this had been happening long before I noticed. Whether the house had always responded in subtle ways. And whether my awareness had simply tuned into something that had been there all along. That idea unsettled me more than any sound ever could. By the end of this phase, one truth had become impossible to ignore. Whatever was answering me did not need noise. It did not need movement. It did not even need intention. It responded to attention itself. And once I understood that, I realized something else, something that made my chest tighten in a quiet, steady way. There was no way to unlearn that awareness. By this point, I had stopped trying to explain what was happening. Not because I had accepted it, but because explanation no longer fit what I was experiencing. What mattered now was interaction. Because this was the stage where the responses stopped feeling accidental in any useful sense. They began to feel addressed. The shift was subtle at first. A refinement in timing. A precision that made coincidence harder to argue. The responses no longer appeared loosely around moments of attention, they began landing inside them. Right at the point where awareness sharpened. Right when a thought finished forming. Right when I noticed myself noticing. That precision changed everything. I remember standing in one spot late one night, not moving, not testing anything. I had decided to stop engaging entirely. No observation. No curiosity. No internal commentary. Just presence. The quiet stretched. Longer than usual. Then a sound appeared. Soft, controlled, and unmistakably placed. The timing was exact. Not before my stillness. Not after. Inside it. And for the first time, I felt something close to being addressed. I didn't respond out loud. But something in me shifted. A kind of recognition. And almost immediately, another sound followed. Different again. Shorter. Adjusted. It felt like a reply to that internal shift. That was the moment I understood something unsettling. Whatever this was, it wasn't reacting to behavior anymore. It was tracking awareness itself. After that night, the pattern became clearer. When I tried to ignore it completely, nothing happened. When I tried to provoke it, nothing happened. But when I simply noticed, without tension, without expectation, that was when it responded. It felt less like cause and effect and more like alignment. I began to wonder whether what I called responses were actually acknowledgments. Not messages. Not signals. Acknowledgments. The difference matters. Because acknowledgment implies recognition. And recognition implies some form of attention directed back at me. At this point, I made a decision. I decided to set boundaries. Not out loud. Not formally. Just internally. I told myself I would no longer engage. No tracking. No testing. No interpretation. I would live normally and let whatever this was fade into irrelevance. That decision lasted exactly one night. I was lying still, not thinking about anything specific. The room was quiet. My attention drifted in that unfocused way that comes before sleep. Then, very gently, something happened. A sound appeared, closer than usual, but calm. Not startling. Just present. And with it came a strange sense of timing that made my chest tighten. Because it happened at the precise moment I let my guard down. I didn't react. I didn't move. But inside, something shifted. A thought formed without effort. You noticed. Immediately after that thought, another sound followed. Different again. Placed carefully. Deliberately. It felt like confirmation. And that was the first time I truly understood that my internal state wasn't just being observed, it was being answered. From that point on, the exchanges became more refined. Not more frequent. More precise. The responses seemed to adapt to how aware I was. If I focused too hard, nothing happened. If I relaxed, something often did. If I tried to ignore everything, the quiet held. But if my attention softened naturally, the pattern returned. It was as if whatever was responding preferred neutrality. Balance. Openness without pursuit. This realization changed how I moved through my own home. I became careful with my attention. Careful with stillness. Careful with moments where my thoughts slowed too much. Because those moments felt like invitations. And I wasn't sure what I was inviting. One night, I tried something I hadn't done before. I didn't speak. I didn't think deliberately. I simply acknowledged, internally, that something was happening. Not fearfully. Not skeptically. Just honestly. The response came almost immediately. Closer than I expected. Clear enough to remove doubt. And different from anything before it. Not louder. Not sharper. Just, specific. It felt placed for me. That was the moment I realized something important. This wasn't escalation. It was refinement. The interaction wasn't growing in intensity. It was growing in accuracy. After that, the house began to feel less like a backdrop and more like a participant in timing. Moments lined up too cleanly. Silences arrived with intention. Sounds appeared with purpose. And the absence of sound felt just as meaningful as its presence. I started to notice something else too. When I was emotionally unsettled, nothing happened. When I was tense, nothing happened. When I was distracted, nothing happened. But when I was calm, not numb, not guarded, that's when the responses appeared. It was as if the system avoided interference. As if it required a certain clarity. That realization unsettled me more than anything else. Because clarity is not something you can fake. And once you know what invites a response, you also know how fragile that boundary is. The final moment I'll describe happened late one night. I had been sitting quietly for a long time. No testing. No listening. Just stillness. My thoughts slowed. My breathing settled. And in that space, I became aware of being aware. That exact moment. And then it happened. A sound, familiar, controlled, unmistakably placed. So close in timing that it felt synchronized. I didn't flinch. I didn't react. I simply registered it. And then something else happened. Silence followed, not empty, not passive. Held. Intentional. Like a pause waiting for acknowledgement. I didn't give one. I stayed still. And slowly, the moment passed. The house returned to quiet. Nothing else followed. But something had changed. Because I understood now that whatever this was didn't need noise to communicate. It worked through timing. Through awareness. through attention. Since then, I've learned to live with a different relationship to quiet. I no longer assume silence means nothing is happening. And I no longer assume responses mean danger. What unsettles me most is how subtle it all is. How easy it would be to miss. How easy it would be to dismiss. And how impossible it becomes to forget once you notice. I still live here. The house still sounds the same to anyone else. Nothing dramatic ever happens. No clear proof. No obvious events. Just moments. Timing. Awareness. And the feeling that something notices when I do. I don't know what it means. I don't know what it wants. And I don't know whether noticing it changed something permanently. But I do know this. Once you become aware of how quiet spaces respond to attention, it's hard to stop noticing. And once you notice, you start to wonder how many other places do the same thing. By now, I've stopped trying to explain it. Not because I gave up. Not because I'm afraid. But because explanation doesn't matter anymore. What matters is attention. Awareness. Presence. The house responds not to movement, not to noise, not to testing, it responds to noticing. And once you notice, you can't unnotice. I still live here. The sounds are quiet. Controlled. Measured. Some nights, I barely hear anything at all. Other nights, a single sound appears, perfectly timed, exactly when my attention softens. And in those moments, I realize something simple. Silence is not empty. It carries intention. It holds weight. And it can answer back in ways you never expected. I've tried to set boundaries. I've tried to ignore it. I've tried to test it. And each time, I've learned the same thing. You cannot fully control it. You cannot fully predict it. All you can do is be aware, and respect the quiet. So now, I live differently. I notice more. I listen more. I respect the pauses. And I remember that even when nothing happens, something is still paying attention. Because awareness is all it takes to be noticed. And here's my question to you. Have you ever stopped, in a quiet space, and truly paid attention? Not just hearing, but noticing. Because if you do, maybe, just maybe, it will notice you too. If this story unsettled you, if it made you pause and listen to the silence around you, hit the like button. Share your own experiences in the comments. Have you ever felt a space respond to you? And don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications, because the quiet has a way of waiting, and the next story could be closer than you think.